Okay, I'm looking at the 9th slide, and there is a thought question from your textbook that I thought was interesting, dealing with the victim's distance when the teacher was shocking the learner. That's the idea of Milgram. And here we have any victim's distance from any kind of crime. So imagine you had the power to prevent either a tsunami that would kill 25,000 people on the other side of the world, a crash that would kill 250 people at your local airport, or a car accident that would kill a close friend. Which would you prevent? Now, go ahead and take a second and think about it. Chances are you'd choose the close friend, and that's the crux of the idea. The closer someone is to you, the harder it is to hurt them. That's, emotional closeness, but it's also physical closeness, because these people you may never know. And even though it's much better to prevent the tsunami, that's actually miraculous, to prevent that and save 25,000 people, it's much easier to ignore those people and sort of put them out of your mind than it is to lose your really close friend. So that's the idea, is, what's the right thing to do? Probably save more people. What's the more common thing, the more likely thing that you would do? Would probably be to save your friend. And I'm not saying that that's what you should do, but it's a tough one. And that's hopefully just the idea, is to illustrate how closeness makes hurting more difficult. A couple more things about Milgram. He did, like I said, a number of iterations of this, and one of my favorites is the transience of authority. So at one point the experimenter had authority, but then somebody comes in and takes over and says, hey, I'm in charge now, you go ahead, and now you're going to be the learner. So the learner is the one who was shocked, the teacher is the one who was the subject, the teacher was the one who was giving the shocks, and the question was, how much would the teacher shock the learner? Well, the experimenter was previously the one who was ordering the teacher to do the shocks, and now somebody comes in, takes off the lab coat of the experimenter, puts the lab coat on him or herself, and is like, okay, now I'm in charge. You go ahead, experimenter, and sit down and try to do this task. Now, what would you predict? This person had been previously ordering you to hurt someone else, and you had been doing it, because most people did. And now the authority figure no longer has authority, but rather is now the victim, or the potential victim. Do you think that having once had power actually helped? I mean, did it make them less likely to harm the person, more likely? Let's talk about that in class. I want you to think about that. You think they're trying to get revenge on that person? You think that they feel like they could still get retaliation from that person later on? Anyway, I'll tell you what they found later on, if you didn't already discover it in the book. But this goes a lot more into detail than the book does, because there's so much with Milgram. And then another thing on this slide 10 here, peers quitting. The people who, if you put people in groups and one person was supposed to read the instructions, the other person was supposed to decide whether it was correct answer, and then the real participant, those were Confederates again, the real participant is the one who gives the shock. When one of the other or both of the other peers would quit, then that actually decreased the chances that the participant would actually continue shocking. They would, again, defect as well. They'd say, hey, forget this, I don't want to do this either. Now, interestingly enough, too, without directly experiencing the shock themselves, if they were just, for example, determining whether the question was right or wrong, or if they were reading the question, then almost everybody went along with the shock all the way to the end, because they weren't actually delivering the shocks themselves. But think about it, they were still part of it. They were still in line. Their reading the question was what ultimately led to the person being shocked, but because they weren't personally delivering the shock, they didn't feel responsible, and therefore they didn't have a problem with giving the shock. I mean, they may have had a problem with it, they may have felt good about it, but they could always sort of reduce their dissonance by saying, well, I'm not really doing the shock, I'm just reading the word pairs, or I'm just saying whether it's right or not. So as far as the classic studies go, as far as ethics goes, Milgram, obviously problematic. I always used to tell people we could never replicate that study because it was way too hard on the participants, even though no one was really shocked. It was all just a ruse. It was all just made up. And if you watch the videos, you'll see how happy everyone is to see that the participants or the learners, the Confederates, weren't really being shocked. They're just so relieved that they weren't really hurting the person. They didn't want to hurt the person. They just felt like they had to. They felt like they didn't have a choice. They didn't think about it. They weren't able to. They didn't have a script for how to get out of the situation. They're just so used to doing what other people tell them. And plus, they use the foot in the door. The foot in the door is extremely important in this. And make sure you understand how that incremental increase of compliance works, because it's really tricky. It's really insidious. It gets so many bad things happening. It gets good things happening too, but more often I think it's used for bad. Abusive situations, for example. I always tell people, and it's awful, but on the first date, dating abuse is huge right now. It has been for a while, but not nearly as bad as marital abuse. But so on the first date, the person you're going out with does not throw you down the stairs on the first date. You would just call that whole thing off right away. Instead, they might talk down to you a little bit, or maybe 2 dates in, they'll talk down to you, and then maybe a few dates later, they might give you a little swat or a smack or something, just in joke, whatever. And so it kind of incrementally creeps up until eventually, after a year or so, then you're getting thrown down the stairs because you're used to already saying, well, this isn't so bad. I didn't object to this before. This must be okay. And that's how the Milgram study got people to be so compliant, or one of the ways that it got them to be so compliant. So ethically, even though people really struggled and felt guilty about what they did, they actually gained a lot too. Interviews post-study indicated that people were really grateful to have learned something about themselves. They felt really good about that. That they didn't know they were capable of that. So ethically, it was harmful, but compared to Zimbardo's study, where it just kind of went out of control and the experimenter himself actually got sucked into it and sort of lost control, I think that Milgram's study is probably a little bit less problematic. And in fact, it has been replicated in the last decade, and I thought, no way are they ever going to do this now that we have institutional review boards to make sure that things are ethically compliant. Well, apparently it's okay. And the way they were able to do it was simply to, instead of going all the way to 450 volts, caution potentially lethal, or XXX, it just went to 150 volts, and it said danger severe shock or something like that. So they changed it slightly, but the same thing happened. It was the same idea, and they replicated it, and they found that just over 50% of the people still went all the way. So the shock was less, and that's how they were able to get it through the ethics board. But still, I'm just really shocked that they let them do this shock experiment once again. Okay, so yeah, just be aware of how foot in the door works in here, and if we haven't talked about foot in the door enough yet, make sure we do. Remind me in class, or make sure you read that part of the book. The power of the situation, of course, the theme of this discipline is, you think that you won't do something, you think that you know what you'll do in a situation, but you can't be 100% sure until you're in that situation. And social psychology is awesome because it presents these crazy situations so that you're kind of open to the idea of going against the norm when you're sort of put in a situation that you're not expecting, because ideally you can draw from your memory and like, oh, wait a second, I don't have to go along with this script. I don't have to go along with what everybody's doing, because that's part of what we do as a species that's problematic. So the power of the situation, don't underestimate it. And then, of course, the fundamental attribution error. Hopefully you guys can see how that plays in to this entire study. If not, make sure you come and ask me in class or talk to each other, because I want to make sure that you guys get that. And then there are a couple things that I have on slide 12 regarding ethics about Milgram's study, and some people kind of trying to dismiss the cruelty of it, and other people saying that it's really a much bigger deal than they're making too big a deal about it. So I wanted to ask you guys what you thought. Make sure you read slide 12 and those questions and see what you think. And then finally, what predicts conformity? Well, if you have a bunch of people going along with whatever it is that's that's going down, whether it's, something bad that's happening, whether it's underage drinking, whether it's, someone trying to get you to smoke. Essentially, the larger the group size, the more likely you are to comply. But there's actually a magic number here, and this also deals with things like the classic study where they had people walking down the street, and they had a Confederate who was looking up like this and trying to sort of see, acting like they were looking at something. And very few people would walk past and look up also when only one person was standing there. A few more when there were two standing there, and a few more when three were standing there. But it maxed out at when 5 people were standing there. When 5 people are all standing on the street corner looking up, and other people are walking by, most of them would actually look up, at least for a second, and see what the heck are they looking at. So they felt like with 5, it's like a legitimate number. That's not just some weirdo looking up. It's actually 5 people. But the interesting thing is that if you put 6 or 10, you'd think that even more people would stop, but they don't. 5 is like the magic number. Once you get to 5, that's enough. And whether it's 5 or 25, the same number of people are going to look up. If they're going to look up, they're going to look up if there are 5. Some of them might look up if there's 1, but very many fewer. So group size is important, with the magic number being 5. So if you think about Ash's study with the people going around the table, all you would really need is 5 other people to convince you that you should probably go along with a group. You'd think that 25 might be even more, but it doesn't really work that way. 5 is enough. 4, not quite enough. Especially if one of them disagrees. If one other of the Confederates disagrees, then you totally, as a participant, will not go along with those other 4 or 3 who were saying the wrong answer. The other thing is the unanimity. Like I said, if one person goes against the group, besides the participant, besides you, if you see someone else going against the group, then you are much more likely to go against the group as well, if you're inclined to do so. And most of this research is about being pressured to do something you don't want to do. And so if you feel pressured, going along with what it is, and if you see someone standing up and saying, hey, this is wrong, it makes it that much easier for you to stand up with somebody else also doing it. It's ideally you be that person to stand up. Now that you know about all this and how it can happen, hopefully you will look around, nobody else is doing anything, you got to be the one to stand up and say, hey, this is wrong. And it's hard. It's really hard to do that. That's, again, breaking a social norm. It's very difficult. Cohesion, the cohesiveness of the group, how close they are to one another, if they feel like they all agree with each other and they're all on the same page. That whole groupthink we talked about, where people get going on a bad decision, those things, people will conform even if they secretly don't want to go with a certain decision. They will, because they feel like they don't want to break up that cohesion. They don't want to mess with the friendships that they have, or the closeness that and the norms that they have established with those people. Status as well. If you are a high status person, you have more right to stand up, or you're more likely to feel comfortable and feel that you have the right to stand up against something. And if a high status person stands up, even if other people don't want to go along with that, it makes it easier for you as an individual to side with that person who has high status. There have been a number of studies that show that even jaywalkers will be more likely to jaywalk with a well-dressed person also jaywalking compared to a bummy-looking person jaywalking. And so status really does help predict conformity. And if a well-dressed person goes all the way to the crosswalk, like the way they're supposed to, and then waits for the light and then crosses, other people are much more likely to do the same thing compared to if a bummy person does that. So we like to follow the people who seem like they're high status. Public response, like I mentioned with the ASH study, if you already go, it's line C, you're not going to go back and change your answer. Once you've made a public commitment, once you've said something out in public, you're not going to change it. And also with the no prior commitment, if you've already given your answer, especially if it's public, then to go back and change that looks really, really stupid and like bad character. And so people are generally less likely to conform in those situations. So hopefully you understand all those things that contribute to conformity and predict what's going on. And on the next slide, slide 14, you can see that the passers-by study, where people, see how many people look up, and you can see that it basically plateaus at 5 people No, after 5, not very many other people additionally will look up. But about 80% of the people will look up when 5 people are standing there, compared to only about maybe 20 or 30%, maybe 40%, who will look up when there's one person there looking around. There's another slide here on the unanimity of conformity. It just shows when the majority of people who are all going in one direction, maybe not a popular direction, maybe not a good direction, but by popular I mean successful, where they're all going along with the decision, and then there's a single dissenter, that one person makes it much easier to defy that unanimous group of others. Now, real quick, there are two kinds of influence that explain why we conform. One of them is normative influence, and the other one is informational influence. And these map, in my opinion, directly onto the types of conformity, compliance, and acceptance. Normative influence is based on a desire to gain acceptance. So you go along with whatever it is because the normative influence tells you that if I do this, I'll be liked. If I don't, I won't. I'll be rejected. And that's extremely powerful, as we'll learn about in the relationships chapter. The informational influence, on the other hand, is when people accept information about reality from others. So they're not really sure what's going on. They're like, what's happening? What do I do? Oh gosh, there's a crowd of people running this way. There must be a problem. There must be some kind of emergency. I'm not going to stop and wait and see what it is. I'm going to trust them. I'm going to take the information that they're giving me, and I'm going to run too. So whereas one normative influence is where you want to be accepted and gain status in a group, or maybe just maintain membership in a group, and therefore you'll go along with things that you don't necessarily want to stay in that group. Think peer pressure. Informational influence happens when you really just aren't sure what's going on. And think back to the ASH study where they weren't sure how far that little dot was going, and so they looked to each other to get information. It wasn't that they were afraid of being ousted from the group or afraid of being looked at as stupid. They simply didn't really know. And so if you look at the next slide, the think, pair, share, normative influence tends to lead to blank, while informational influence more likely leads to blank. I want you to go ahead and answer that question and bring your answer to class and see if you can get that one. It should be pretty obvious after I've talked about it. And if you have any questions about normative versus informational influence and the studies that go along with each of those, feel free to ask me in class. Whew, getting pooped out here. Who conforms? There's different personalities. Introverts may go along with a group more than extroverts, although extroverts also sometimes, depending if they're agreeable or not, will go along with the group because they want to be liked, and they've also got more positive affect. So it's kind of complicated as to who will conform, but there's certain personality characteristics that definitely go along with the group more than others, and agreeableness is one of them. That's just like kind and wanting to get along with others. Culture also, some cultures, conformity is essential. Like that's what you do. You don't go against that. Japan, for example, extremely important that you conform. If you don't conform, your life is ruined. If you do any infraction, any social misstep, you won't go to college, you'll be doomed forever. Other cultures the same way. There's a lot of pressure to conform, whereas our culture, we actually, even though we conform a lot more than we like to think, it's kind of romanticized to us to be the one to stand up, the heroic person who says, hey, I won't tolerate this is wrong. And so for us, there's a cultural difference between us and some other cultures where conformity is looked upon as a noble thing. We sort of see it as a limitation and a weakness, but we still have it, and we still do it a lot more maybe than we realize. And then social roles, which are defined as a cluster of norms, and something like what it takes, what the roles of a mother or a professor or a student, all those things come together. What are you expected of, or what's expected of you? Who conforms? People who have social roles that put them in a situation where they are supposed to go along with the crowd, they are more likely to conform, as opposed to people who have social roles that allow them to step outside, to be the hero or whatever. They're not, their roles don't define them as going along with the group as much. And the story of Patricia Hearst, you should make sure that you read about that in the textbook. She was one of the first people to be diagnosed with what we call Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome is, basically she was kidnapped and she went along with her captors, sympathized with them, and ultimately became part of their liberation army, and pleaded essentially innocent to killing a bunch of people because she said, hey, I wasn't really in my right mind when I did it. And since then, a lot of people have been documented as having this kind of way of dealing with being in a kidnapped situation. You kind of go along with the people who are kidnapping you because it's like all you can do, especially since in particular Patricia Hearst was very sheltered. She had no attitude inoculation. She had no way to argue against what these people were telling her. Instead, she just was kind of bombarded with all these ideas and all these orders, and eventually just sort of took their side. And then she went back to being a regular heiress after she, I believe she actually did serve time for that, but we should look into that and see exactly what happened. That's a very fascinating story. I think it happened back in the 70s. And then role reversal, taking the opposite role of what you're supposed to have, can really help you see the other perspective. I want to talk to you guys about the camera perspective study, especially with the death row and the guilt versus innocence decisions. Taking the opposite role really helps you defy obedience or go against what the norm is saying, because you can see from the other perspective, what's the worst that can happen if I do the opposite? Well, it's really not that bad. And then finally, reactance. This is the fancy name for reverse psychology, basically. It's what happens is when someone tells you not to do something, especially in this country, I don't know how it works in other countries, but when someone tells you not to do something, don't smoke, don't drink, don't, no sex before marriage, it creates a motive, or there's already a motive that we have, but it activates a motive that we have to protect and or restore the freedom that we feel that we deserve, that we have, we're entitled to. And when someone threatens that by telling us what to do or telling us they're going to take away our freedoms, we act against that. So you want to make sure that you don't, when you're trying to convince someone to do something, you aren't inciting reactance in them, because that will activate their desire to be unique and to stand out from the crowd rather than to go along with it. So, when you're trying to get people to be obedient, and I really wanted to talk a little bit about Hitler and the whole Nazi thing this class, because to me it's amazing. It goes back with the persuasion stuff to a certain extent, but so much of it goes along with him taking advantage of the foot in the door and pre-existing stereotypes and just all kinds of things that we've already talked about a little bit in psychology, and how he basically got people to do things that really I don't think most people would be able to do had it not been for his leadership, as well as the tricks that he used, the psychological tricks that he used. If you have any questions, bring them to class, and make sure that you do write down some questions, as well as your answers to some of the questions that I posed here and some of your responses to the thought question. And I will see you next time.